Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We've got a lot to cover in this first hour. We'll see how much we can fit into the first hour. First of all, we have at least one more Me Too reckoning. This is, again, one that's pretty shocking. The Attorney General of the state of New York will get into that in just a bit. And I might just mention that our most recent issue on Outlook is about the hashtag Me Too movement, and also want to quote just one or two things from Heather McDonald, who's talking about the negative impact of the hashtag Me Too movement. So that's one issue we won't spend a lot of time on, but I wanted to get into. Then I was thinking that sometime soon I might talk about the subject of sex education and abstinence, because there have been some battles on Capitol Hill already beginning to brew. Well, the front page of USA Today, actually, sex and sex ed, the age-old struggle between morality versus reality enters a new era. So I guess, if nothing else, this issue of USA Today will give us a reason to talk about that today. One of the articles I have posted is a piece that came out actually yesterday by Robert Knight. I mentioned it, giving Trump's accomplishment their due. And so I thought I would read just a few of those, because he has found that many people get so caught up on Stormy Daniels. And of course, there's some things there. And of course, not to mention the hashtag Me Too movement and what that might mean for the president, and some of the inner workings and what happens with Paul Manafort and the judges and everything. Kind of forget, has anything been accomplished? Well, yes, quite a bit has. So we wanted to get into that. So we'll talk about that. Then, if we have time in this hour, David French's piece, which we've also posted, I called it Free Speech and Civil Liberties. In hindsight, I wish I'd called it Civil Liberties equals Hate Speech, because that's really what's starting to come out, is that if you believe in freedom of speech, then at the very least, that's an example of white privilege. At the worst, it's an example of hate speech. So we'll get into that. And, of course, the Justice Department finding itself in all sorts of trouble, not the least of which is one of the articles I've posted on the redactions in some of the things that have been released by the Justice Department actually aren't there to protect national security. It's there to protect some of the people that have been in the Justice Department that have done something wrong, in some cases maybe even done something that is criminal. And if that's not enough, there's a talk right now about holding the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, in contempt. The only Attorney General that's been held in contempt is the previous one, Eric Holder. So I don't think Jeff Sessions wants to be number 2 on that list, but that maybe has less to do with him and more to do with his department not issuing and providing information. So we've got just a few things to cover in the next hour or so, and if we don't get to all of those, then maybe we'll cover those in the third hour if you haven't a chance to listen in as well. But let's take one of the lead stories today. New York's State's top prosecutor, a public defender of hashtag Me Too movement, and an antagonist of Donald Trump. You think? Because this is a man who has filed numerous legal challenges against the Trump administration. Eric Schneiderman, 63-year-old progressive Democrat. That's a mild statement as well, probably as liberal and as progressive as you can find in the state of New York. Elected as a second term as state attorney general, resigned after being accused of physically assaulting 4 women. The person that released this is the individual that actually broke some of the news with Harvey Weinstein. And again, you have to say, why did it take so long? And I think there are two reasons. Number one, power. Number two, politics. Power, he held power over those individuals. That's the Harvey Weinstein issue. That is, if you will, the Matt Lauer issue. These are individuals that can make or break your career. So some women just say, I'll suffer in silence. I'm not going to take the chance that this person will ruin me. And he had the ability, perhaps even more than the other two men I just mentioned a minute ago, to ruin those individuals. But there's a second issue that people have been pointing out, and that is if you take the right political stance, i.e. liberal, progressive, pro-women, pro-choice, feminist, sometimes you get a pass on that. And I've heard people say that the list of those individuals that fit into that category is very long. And I came across a piece that maybe we'll talk about later in the week by Victor Davis Hanson, because really the piece he's writing is all the people who thought they were going to unseat Donald Trump themselves either have gotten thrown out on their ear or will be. He's talking about, for example, some of the problems the Mueller investigation is running into. He's talked about some of the deep state people like John Brennan, James Clapper, James Comey, Andrew McCabe, who looked like they were immune from any kind of accountability, and maybe that's changing. And then he goes through, and this is what I wanted to use, the list of those people whose reputations were ruined by the hashtag #MeToo movement. And the short list that he has here is, it's possible that Tom Brokaw could be lumped into this list, so we'll put him as a question mark, but then let's look at all the others. Mark Halperin, Dustin Hoffman, Garrison Keillor, Larry King, Matt Lauer, Ryan Lissa, Charlie Rose, Tavis Smiley, Kevin Spacey, Harvey Weinstein. Well, you can go down the list, but what you see is very quickly the point he was making. Once upon a time, Americans assumed that Tom Brokaw, Matt Lauer, Dan Rather, or Charlie Rose were the go-tos for ethical and sober journalism. That no longer holds. And when you start looking down that list, you start realizing that list is made up almost exclusively of individuals who I think could be fairly called Democrat, liberal, progressive. Now, are there Republicans? Yes. As a matter of fact, one in the state of Texas, and we're all familiar with that, and we can go through a couple others that certainly fit into that category. But it is kind of striking to think about how is it, and this certainly comes up when you start looking at this individual, 4 different women over a period of time physically assaulted. Eric Snyderman, only when this finally comes out in New Yorker Magazine, does that then lead to his resignation. And if you don't have the May issue of Outlook, let me encourage you to maybe write and get a copy. Those of you that are donors either have received it in the mail or will shortly. And we have Penna Dexter doing a very good piece on Me Too is a Mixed Bag, looking at some of the abuse. Larry Nassar, for example, with the gymnastics team, and some of the other examples, some of the outstanding and well-known actors, actresses, and others. And then my piece on sexual harassment, which is in really a sense a summary of some of the material we were able to obtain because of the interview we did with June Hunt. But another person that we've had on the program, and maybe it's time to have her back, is Heather McDonald. You know, we've had her on more recently when we talked about her book, The War on Cops. Well, recently she gave a speech at Hillsdale College entitled The Negative Impact of the Me Too Movement. Now, of course, the negative impact for some of these people that have been predators is well known, but she's also concerned that eventually what this is going to do is just maybe give a second wind to some of the secular, liberal, anti-Christian feminism. And so that's maybe a conversation we'll have when Penna Dexter joins us. But if nothing else, wanted to start off with, again, an item in the news. The New York Attorney General, who seemed incredibly powerful, has stepped down because of hashtag Me Too movement, and so he's the latest scalp in the hashtag Me Too reckoning. We come back, we're going to talk about abstinence and sex education. It affects you and your family and your tax dollars, so we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the Bible gives us a story of the world told through God's perspective. That is why the Christian worldview provides the best explanation of the world. It answers questions like, why am I here? And what is my purpose in life? Greg Koukl provides a big-picture introduction to the story of the Bible in his new book, The Story of Reality, How the World Began, How It Ends, and Everything Important That Happens in Between. He was on my radio program recently to talk about how this book can answer questions Christians and non-Christians have. Christians need this book to put the puzzle together. Dump a puzzle at your feet and you will see what the Christian puzzle looks like for many believers. It's a pile of pieces that they've never tried to put together. To make matters worse, some of the pieces come from other worldviews and don't even fit the puzzle. This book puts the puzzle together. Non-Christians need this book because it tells the true story of history in a way that makes sense. Greg Koukl anticipates questions and skepticism they may have about the story and answers those questions with his extensive apologetic background. He reminds them that this isn't a religious fairy tale. It's a true story of the way things are. The narrative backbone of the story includes 5 parts: God, man, Jesus, cross, and resurrection. The Bible takes you through a theological tour of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. Christians will be able to fill in the pieces of the puzzle. Non-Christians will be able to see the big picture and understand why it is important for them to make a decision about the truthfulness of the gospel. The Story of Reality would be a great sermon series or Bible study for Sunday school classes or small groups, and it is a book to hand to someone who does not understand the gospel and may even think that it is irrelevant. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you listen to Point of View any length of time, you know that one of the things I'm really trying to do is help you to develop some discernment. When you read something in the newspaper, you hear something, even on this radio program, you watch something on television, you go to a website to think through with some discernment. But more importantly, I think it also is important in terms of discernment to recognize when a campaign is heating up. And yesterday, I saw a piece that was put together by Tony Perkins' people at Family Research Center. Maybe he wrote all this, maybe someone helped him write it, but we'll just say that Tony wrote it, but I'm sure because of some of the research, he probably had some background research done for it. And they were responding to the New York Times editorial page on Sunday. And so I was going to maybe read that later in the week. And then I said, maybe we need to talk about it right away because the Tuesday edition, that is today's edition of USA Today, front page, and I guess I can hold it up for those of you watching on the screen here, Sex, an age-old struggle of morality versus reality enters a new era, and it's all about sex ed, sex education, politics, pop culture, even the Me Too shift, the battleground again. So when you have New York Times on Sunday, USA Today on Tuesday, really, in a sense, reigniting a battle on sex education, you got to believe this is going to be one of those topics we're going to be hearing about. And this is another aspect of discernment, to recognize that these theme articles and these theme movements are sometimes generated with a handful of individuals who, working with various editors and opinion leaders in various newspapers, news organizations, began to bring about, in this case, what I think is a full-scale assault on abstinence. Now, that has not really been a big issue until fairly recently, because abstinence education was funded quite well in the 1990s, but it faded quite a bit under the Clinton administration. It wasn't picked up a whole lot under the Bush administration, and it was completely, in a sense, ended under the Obama administration, in large part because once there was the passage of the Affordable Care Act, oftentimes referred to as Obamacare, there was an actual specification that it would establish what is called a teen pregnancy prevention program. It was actually established through the Affordable Care Act. So then this was really, if you will, full-scale funding of the sex education programs, what are called comprehensive sex education programs, and pretty much the ending of any kind of funding of abstinence education. Now, again, using the numbers from USA Today, they remind us that 24 states and the District of Columbia require sex education in the schools. You have 37 states require that information on abstinence be provided, but it usually is not abstinence only. It's abstinence maybe mentioned at the tail end of conversations about sex and a variety of other things. And I might have to give a parental advisory here, because sooner or later I'm going to have to use a word or two that maybe you might be aware isn't one that you would want maybe a grade school child to listen to, although I would assume most of them would be in school right now, so it shouldn't be a big issue. And then, of course, you have 26 states that require that abstinence be stressed. So just reading, first of all, from USA Today, and then I'm going to give you kind of the rest of the story from our friends at the Family Research Center. They say in USA Today, for more than a century, the nation has engaged in a war over sex education in America's schools. Battles ignite around questions that seem practical but decidedly moral. Should teens be given more information about sex or less? Well, of course, that's a little bit of a bias, even the way the questions ask. Should they be encouraged to wait until marriage? Do young people have a right to understand their sexuality, or do adults have the duty to protect them from it? And you can see where that one's taking you, but okay, we'll go on. Fierce debate and disagreement on the answers has led to a debate over the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program, the federal initiative which began in 2010 under President Obama, which, again, was part of the Affordable Care Act. A lot of people don't even realize that, but I just thought I'd fill that in since it doesn't show up in the article, but later on you can find it in the sidebars. But okay, now they say President Trump wants to defund the program, but in the past month, 3 federal judges ruled to block the administration's cut to grants issued through the initiative. Advocates of the program say it is a proven track record of success. But then again, you have the Department of Health and Human Services said the program had no impact or had a negative impact on teen behavior. And so, again, those, if you will, are the two opposing views that are presented in this article. You can read on in which, for a while, they quote from all sorts of people that are for comprehensive sex education. Deborah Hauser, Advocates for Youth. A little bit later, you run into somebody who is with SICUS, and a variety, which is called the Sexual Information and Education Council. But, again, trying to be somewhat fair, and I'll give credit where credit is due to USA Today. They do have one quote from Robert Rector, who is with the Heritage Foundation, who back in 2010 actually put together a report on the benefits of abstinence-only education. But, of course, that's the only thing that kind of gives you that perspective. So with that as background, I thought we'd come to the response that comes from Tony Perkins and Family Research Council to what appeared in the New York Times on Sunday. They said this: fake news is alive and well and thriving on the pages of America's biggest newspapers. No wonder more people are tuning out the media. They don't trust it, and outlets like the New York Times aren't giving them any reason to try. They said at some point the Times editorial board must have gotten together and decided to reprint every lie ever told about abstinence education. Pretty strong, but okay, let's go on. The result was Saturday's work of fiction. I take that back. It was on the Saturday editorial, not the Sunday editorial. Saturday's work of fiction, a breathtakingly dishonest 602-word crime scene of journalism that justifies America's growing distrust of the press. About the only thing that was accurate about the column was its placement on the opinion page, where it can't be passed off as legitimate news. So, let's get into this. First of all, Tony Perkins and the people at FRC said the editor's agenda was obvious, discrediting a sex ed approach that's popular
effective and grossly underfunded. They barely got the byline in before the absurdities began, starting with the Times insistence that the Department of Health and Human Services is somehow advancing an anti-science ideological agenda by trying to level the funding field for abstinence. I'll point out in just a minute how that's not accurate at all, but let's go on. The department last year prematurely ended grants to some teen pregnancy prevention programs, claiming weak evidence of success. More recently, it set off new funding rules in favor of abstinence-only approach. Again, that's not true as well, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But again, trying to give the New York Times its due, so at least you can understand what we're responding to. And so then the people at the Family Research Council and Tony Perkins said, if anyone's ignoring science, it's the Times. Barack Obama's own Department of Health and Human Services admitted outright that its contraception-first strategy was a $1 billion failure. There's a link to that, which we can talk about in just a minute. More than 80% of the students in the programs fared either worse or no better than their peers. Hardly the stuff of weak evidence. According to the last administration, Obama's approach was a disaster, resulting in more pregnancies, more sexual initiation, and more oral sex. Not surprising, the Trump administration doesn't think programs that encourage pregnancy are the wisest use of federal funds, so it rewrote the rules, shifting a very modest amount of money, 10 cents of every sex-ed dollar, to this strategy that the Centers for Disease Control agrees is working. But even now, the investment in abstinence isn't close to what the Times' preferred programs are getting. Here's the point. Liberal sex education rakes in about $980 million, okay, compared to about $100 million for what's called sexual risk avoidance, which includes abstinence. So again, when you have the Times saying they're scrapping all the programs, those programs that are sex education programs are still getting almost $1 billion. By contrast, those that include abstinence, about $100 million. That's a 10-to-1 ratio. So right off the bat, you can see some of the things in the editorial are not accurate. Then it says that the editors claim that the administration's approach defies all common sense. There's no good evidence that abstinence-only education prevents or delays young people from having sex, leads them to having fewer sexual partners, or reduces rates of teen pregnancy or sexually transmitted infections. And so, again, the question that the Family Research Council was asking, is the Times fire all of its fact-checkers? The CDC, that is the Centers for Disease Control, blew that myth to bits in 2016, explaining that not only does the abstinence message work, it positively affects every area of kids' lives. And I've even done a commentary that came out just last week on that subject as well, that those who are virgins are not only healthier in terms of their sexual health, but healthier in a variety of other ways. Well, I've got a lot more to say, but I need to take a break. And if you'd like to join us, maybe you have some thoughts about sex education, abstinence, and what your tax dollars should go to. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. And also leave a comment on our Facebook Live broadcast. We'll be back right after this.
Rebecca Hagelin has been influencing public policy as an author, columnist, and executive at places like the Heritage Foundation for more than 30 years, and Point of View Radio stoked her fire.
I used to turn it on every day, and when my husband would come home from work, I would say, this is what they said on Point of View today, and this is what they said. I just wanted to be connected into the places where I could make a difference.
Rebecca has made a big difference with her life, and let's just say she's a big fan.
There's no better resource. There's no better truth sayer. There's no better place to go for information for people who are worthy of their money than Point of View.
Point of View makes a difference by inspiring and informing people who make a difference. And you can make a difference today when you invest in the Truth Team. Join us today. Find out how by calling 1-800-347-5151 or visit online, pointofview.net/team, 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Do you think comprehensive sex education should be taught to your children and grandchildren? Love to get your comments. Or what about the idea of abstinence? And this is a battle that I see brewing, illustrated by the fact that there was an editorial in New York Times. I misspoke earlier. It's on Saturday, not Sunday, but the Saturday editorial in the New York Times. And then today, front page, USA Today, sex ed. I get the sense that we are moving in that direction. So what are the facts? And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to read a little bit from the Family Research Council piece. And then, of course, if you have some comments or questions, I'd love to hear about those from you as well, and just share a few things that I've learned over the years in studying this. And again, just to maybe even be full disclosure, sit on at least one board that has speakers go into the classroom to present abstinence education, as well as they deal with issues like bullying and sexting and a variety of other things. So those are all relevant issues. And then, of course, I've been on another board that's been involved in various risk behaviors as well. So this is something that has been of concern to me. And again, going back to our friends at the Family Research Council, we see that Tony Perkins says that the editors of the New York Times claim that the administration's approach defies all common sense. There's no good evidence that abstinence-only education prevents or delays young people from having sex, leads them to having fewer sexual partners, or reduces rates of teen pregnancy or sexually transmitted infections. Actually, there is. And that evidence goes all the way back to the 1980s and 1990s. I have quite a bit of it that's in my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, a whole chapter on the issue of sex and sex education. But again, I love what our friends at the Family Research Council say. Did the New York Times fire all of its fact checkers? Because they point out that the Centers for Disease Control put out a report just last year in 2016 explaining that not only does the abstinence message work, it positively affects every area of kids' lives. Here's a quote, high school students who are virgins rate significantly and consistently better in nearly all health-related behaviors and measures than their sexually active peers, unquote. If you want some more documentation, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, and find under the viewpoint section, you can type in the issue of virgins, and you will find a piece that I wrote recently that was based on that particular research. And they go on to say that this includes everything from bike helmet and seatbelt use to substance abuse, diet, doctor's visits, exercise, and even tanning bed use. That's a direct quote again from CDC. And so abstinence education is like one-stop shopping for healthier behavior. Of course, then the New York Times it maybe shows their bias, and so that's why the Family Research Council put it this way. They said, unfortunately, the left is too beholden to its culture of permissiveness to listen. For some of them, it's self-indulgence at all costs, so much that they're willing to help kids off the cliff that leads to teen pregnancy and everything that comes with it, financial hardship, school failure, and depression. Matter of fact, even more recently, when I've spoken on this issue, I was actually at the time in Budapest, Hungary, of all places, because I was speaking on the issue of sex education. I point out that the number of individuals who commit suicide or who are depressed is much higher, in some cases almost 3 times higher for sexually active teens than it is for teens that are not sexually active. So you can see that there are some real consequences to oftentimes what is being taught. And the argument is always, well, kids are going to be sexually active. Well, yes, if you teach them how to be, yes, they're going to probably even have some that would not have been sexually active who become so because you've been talking about it in the classroom for so long. And so, again, the point that Family Research Council makes is they refuse to treat sex like every other risk behavior and discourage it. And ironically, that's what teenagers want. And again, I've documented over these surveys over the years that find that a lot of times young girls especially want to know how to say no. They want to be reaffirmed in some of the moral stands they want to take. And when the school comes in and says, well, we know you're all going to be sexually active, so here's a condom and here's how to do it, you can see what the problem is. Now, in a survey of 18 to 19-year-olds, the Barna Group found that what kids care about is learning how to, quote, understand healthy and unhealthy relationships, 65%, avoiding sexual assault, 64%, how alcohol impairs judgment, 61%, and how to say no to sex without losing a relationship, 57%. So those are some surveys that, of course, were done by the Barna Group, but it, again, reinforms and reestablishes some of the things we've known in the past. But again, what we find is that most young people are relationship-driven, not sex-obsessed, and that's one of the lines they use there in the piece. Most of them agree that today's curriculum pressures them too much to have sex, and those who have given in regret it. And that's another link that shows the number of young women in particular that regret getting involved sexually, as well as some of the men as well. They don't think lessons on sexual pleasuring, 26%, are nearly as important as having skills to say no, 63%. And that's another thing the editors misjudge, they say. Teenagers desire to wait. Quote, given that almost all Americans engage in premarital sex, according to the New York Times, quote, this vision of an abstinence outside of marriage world simply is at odds with reality, unquote. Well, that's the New York Times, but again, I love what the Family Research Council says. That's ridiculous. All Americans don't engage in premarital sex, and certainly all teenagers don't. Even the Washington Post points out just how sharply teen sex is declining. Would you believe that about 60% of teens haven't had sex? Most Americans are surprised to hear it, thanks in part to the misinformation campaigns of newspapers like this one. So, nevertheless, that's just another response. But again, some of you might say, well, haven't we been able to prove through various scientific studies that condoms, in particular, reduce STDs? And the answer to that is yes, but you need to dig into the data. Because interestingly enough, the study that is cited most often, and I have this in my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, is a study that was done of those individuals who were AIDS infected, whose partners used condoms, and as a result, those individuals actually did not contract AIDS. And so the argument is, on something as deadly as AIDS, we see that those actually not only reduce, but completely eliminate the possibility of passing on a sexually transmitted disease. In the next 2 minutes, can I tell you the rest of the story? Story number one, first of all, that is AIDS, and in some respects, it's a little more difficult to get than you might have been led to believe. But the point I really want to make is point number one. There are a number of sexually transmitted diseases that condoms do not protect you from because various viruses can be passed even if you are using a condom. So that certainly eliminates that possibility. But the second point, I think, is even more relevant. And since I have some parents here of teenagers on the other side of the glass, I'll see if they shake their head yes or no on this one. When you go back and look at that original study, the one that is cited so often, it says that this shows that condoms were effective when used consistently and correctly. Now, do we have anybody that are parents of teenagers here? Okay. Do the words consistently and correctly go together with teen behavior? Didn't think so. Okay. My kids, mine are older now, but when my kids were teenagers, I could not get them to consistently and correctly brush their teeth. I could not get them to consistently take their lunch bag out the front door. I could not get them to consistently and correctly actually wash off the dishes and put them in a dishwasher. Are you with me on this? Of course you are. So if teenagers have a problem with things called consistently and correctly, what are the chances in a moment of passion they're going to use that particular device consistently and correctly? If I don't at least have a few of you smiling, if not laughing, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The study was true, but as soon as you dig into the requirements of the study and the assumptions of the study, you recognize that it is essentially meaningless when we are talking about teenage behavior. And this is one more reason why, indeed, a lot of people have said that sex education does anything but reduce teen pregnancy. And in many cases, what it does is it actually reduces teen birth. That's another kind of hidden story that was surfacing a number of years ago from a person that was on this program. And that is, interestingly enough, when they talk about reducing teen pregnancy, they define pregnancy by whether or not there's a birth. And there's a difference between teen pregnancy and teen birth. Some of those teenagers who get pregnant, they go to an abortion clinic, and so you think they didn't get pregnant. Oh, they got pregnant. They just aborted their baby. Another one of those stories you need to know about if you dig into the facts. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Liberty Christian Center in Watertown, New York, asked for permission to use the Watertown High School cafeteria for its religious services. As their application stated, the worship services to be conducted in the public school cafeteria would include activities of music, religious instruction, and Christian testimony. But the local school board denied the application, stating that since New York law did not specifically authorize religious organizations to utilize public school buildings, the application had to be denied. The court reviewed previous uses of the public school cafeteria. It found that among other uses, the school had been used to host a local talent night, which featured religious music, religious instruction, and even Christian testimony. Since both the worship service and the local talent show shared a religious purpose and context, it was unlawful for the school to permit the talent show, but deny the use of the facility for a worship service. Some decry the use of a public school by a religious organization as a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. That is simply not true. The First Amendment demands that the school board be neutral toward religion. Letting a secular organization use school property but denying a religious organization the same use is not neutrality, it's hostility. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that in the next hour, we're going to have Randy Frazee with us. What happens after you die, a biblical guide to paradise, hell, and life after death. So we'll get into that. And then the third hour, we'll come back to some of these other issues in the news. But one of the things I did post here is by Robert Knight. He said, I'm told that by one of my favorite millennials that many of her friends have not heard anything at all positive about President Trump. Well, that's certainly the case. And he says that the left, which turned a blind eye to the flagrant immorality of Ted Kennedy and Bill Clinton, is ordering evangelical Christians to abandon Mr. Trump. Before too many well-meaning people take the bait, a reminder of what Mr. Trump has accomplished might be in order. Now, I've said before that I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can say, I'm, appalled by some of the things that Donald Trump has done in the past, and who knows, maybe even something in the recent past. Do not know that. And I can be very upset with that and appalled by some of his behavior. But at the same time, I'll also talk about some of the things that have happened because of administration. Some due to him, some due to the Vice President Mike Pence, some due to the individuals he's put in his cabinet, some due to judges that he's put there. But, to turn a blind eye either to the flagrant immorality as the left did in the past, or to turn a blind eye to it now in some of the actions of Donald Trump is not right. But also to ignore some of the very significant things that have happened in the last year and a half. We don't want to ignore that either. So both are equally true. Sometimes people force us to make a choice. I wish I didn't have to be perfectly honest, but that's just the world that we find ourselves in at the moment. What about some of the things that Donald Trump has done? I'm going to just read a few of these because this goes on for pages, but sometimes it's just helpful, as Robert Knight has done, to remind us of what has indeed taken place. And the first, of course, is the appointment of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, but also more than 75 other constitutionally sound federal judges, 30 of which are serving already. And, of course, many more. And one of the pieces that we talked about on Friday was from Judge James Ho, who has just been put on the court, appointed originally by Donald Trump on the court of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which had just an outstanding initial dissent. Sometimes rookies sit on the bench for a year or two before you even really hear from him. He didn't wait. He's got a little bit of sort of a Ted Cruz type of personality, and right out of the box had some really great things to say. Number 2, reinstated an expanded medical city policy blocking foreign aid from being used for abortions. Number 3, crack down on illegal immigration and sanctuary cities. Of course, a lot more of that needs to take place there, and that's a conversation we'll talk about in others. Number 4, issued an order killing 2 federal regulations for every new one. In actuality, as Robert Knight points out, the ratio is really about 16-1, which has saved billions of dollars. And yesterday we talked with Stephen Moore about some of the impact that has had. Then, of course, we can talk about the historic tax cut for Americans, for business, and the whole issue of tax reform. Another one that's on the list here is withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, ending the threat that international bureaucrats would begin to govern our economy. Then another one on the list is reverse the onerous environmental rules that gave the Environmental Protection Agency authority to destroy the coal industry and abrogate landowners' rights. And so some of that we again mentioned briefly yesterday with Stephen Moore, and another one related to that was the idea of changing the idea of these regulations and as a result facilitating the Keystone XL pipeline and opening up vast areas for oil and gas exploration. Again, one of the conversations we had in the third hour yesterday with Stephen Moore, but you probably didn't have a chance to hear on the local station, was very significant. Then a couple of others that Robert Knight mentioned presided over an economic and stock market boom. If you haven't noticed, the stock market has done rather well lately. Lowered unemployment, 3.9%, I might mention. That's not in the article, but the lowest unemployment since the year 2000, and the lowest recorded unemployment for African Americans ever, which I think is pretty intriguing to look at as well. Brought manufacturing jobs back to America from overseas. Rebuilt the military. Destroyed ISIS and faced down North Korea's Rocket Man. We'll see where that goes. He may be playing us, but right at the moment, it looks like we might see the possibility, at least, of a denuclearized Korean peninsula. That would be kind of interesting. Issued an order enforcing First Amendment protections for religious liberty. You have the Conscience Protections Department that has been developed at the Department of Health and Human Services, run by one of Kelly Shackelford's former employees. And then you have, of course, the signing that took place just the other day on faith-based organizations. All of that fits in there as well. Restored the freedom of military chaplains to espouse biblical morality, essentially reversing the previous president's transgender military policy. Revoked the Education Department's order that public schools allow gender-confused males access to girls' restrooms and locker rooms. Then cracked down on sex trafficking. Again, a story that we've talked about a little bit, interestingly enough, with the president of Concerned Women for America, but something that probably most people are not aware of, the whole law that would allow states to move against various sex ad internet sites, and even the idea of stopping and seizing and shutting down Backpage.com, which carried ads for prostitution as well as trafficked children. Overhauled the mismanaged Veterans Administration, or replaced Obamacare at least incrementally, beginning with the repeal of the individual mandate, imposed sanctions on Venezuela's socialist dictatorship, and revised some of the dealings with communist Cuba, recognized, forgot about this one, we should have mentioned this earlier, Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and started to repair some of the tensions between the United States and Israel that existed in the previous administration. Worked on Central American nations to crack down on MS-13 gangs. And as he says, well, let's stop there because that's just the tip of the iceberg, and we're just about out of time. So anyway, if you find yourself saying, I'd like that list, guess what? That's the first article we've posted on the website, pointofview.net. Maybe you could post that list or post that article, because then from there on, Robert Knight says, okay, that's what Donald Trump as president has done. Here's what Hillary Clinton as president would do. And then that goes on for another page and a half. And again, that's more of a guess, but it's a reasonable guess that just gives you a sense of, indeed, there has been a lot that is accomplished, and there's still a lot more to take place. One of the other articles I've posted here you might want to read on your leisure, and maybe we'll come back to it in maybe our conversation later in the week, especially on our Friday weekend edition. Civil liberties can't survive partisan hatred, and I sort of referred to this as free speech and civil liberties. If I retitled that on our website, I think I would just call it Civil Liberties equals hate speech, at least in the minds of some individuals, because when people say, well, we need to have free speech, we need to allow various ideas to be considered, more and more people are saying, no, you can't be allowed to make that statement. You can't even be allowed to actually have that idea. You can't be allowed to express it, and if you do, that's at least white supremacy. And more likely, it's hate speech. And so that is the world we find ourselves ministering to, and we will certainly spend more time trying to give some responses to that as well. Well, this first hour coming to an end, let me just mention in the next hour, Randy Frazee is going to be with us. He is an individual that up until recently co-taught with Max Lucado and has this new book out, What Happens After You Die. Fascinating conversation about the afterlife. And so we'll talk with Randy Frazee and open up the phones for your comments. All that coming up right after this.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about what happens after you die. It's a conversation we've had here before, but I think you're going to really appreciate this new book that has that title, What Happens After You Die. It is written by Randy Frazee. Is an individual been on the program with us before, the pastor at Westside Family Church, lives in the San Antonio area. Might remember the conversation we had with him about the heart of the story and the whole story church engagement. Also, of course, author of The Connecting Church and a variety of other resources that are available. If you would like to know more about this book, you probably can find it in your local bookstore. It is published by Thomas Nelson, but also we have a link on our website, What Happens After You Die, a biblical guide to paradise, hell, and life after death. And Randy, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. I've always been a big fan of yours and Point of View radio program, so thanks for having me back.
Well, again, let's, if we can, get into this. You talk about your mother dying, and it is paralleling something that I experienced even when my own mother died, in which at the end you go, is that it? There's a sense in which, as you said, the more you kind of saw your mother breathe her last breath, her spirit exited her body, you were like, okay, now what? And so in some respects, that kind of sets you on a journey to begin to discover a little bit more about the biblical truth about the afterlife. True?
It is true. I've got a couple degrees in theology, maybe a few less than you do, but enough I should have known better. But I was in my 30s when my mom, out of nowhere, came down with pancreatic cancer and ended up dying just 3 days before I was to take her on a all expense paid for trip by her son, me, to Niagara Falls. And this death from a brutal disease and watching my mom die it really created a tremendous crisis in my life, a crisis almost like the guy who said to Jesus, I do believe, help me with my unbelief. I wasn't throwing everything out, but two things happened to me, Kerby, that I think the listeners might find helpful coming from someone in my position. And that is, number one, I questioned whether or not he believed anything happened at all. I wanted to believe, but my heart couldn't embrace it. And the second thing was the vision I currently have of the afterlife. I just have to be honest, it's not very compelling to me. And so there's got to be more. And so it sent me on a journey for sure back into the scriptures, but this time with no sermon to prepare, no denominational axe to grind. I was just wanting to know the truth, and I needed it because it was the basis of my hope.
And it's interesting that one of the questions your mother asked you is one of the ones you address, and that is Jesus enough? I mean, she took you back to, what was it, 1977, and really begin to think about when she had you pray with her, and now she's turning that around. I remember I'd written a book on the subject of death, and my mother read the book, and she said, well, it was interesting. I've always been giving you spiritual advice. As I read your book, you were, in a sense, giving me spiritual advice. But there's a point in time where sometimes in that moment you say, okay, have I done everything I'm supposed to do? And that was a question she asked you.
She did. Kerby, as a pastor, I've done, hundreds upon hundreds of funerals, and I've watched dozens and dozens of people die. But now this one is my mom. We're in the back of a travel van that they had purchased to see the country. It was only really ever used to take her on a one-way trip to the Cleveland Clinic Hospital. In the back of that van, she asked me the question, is Jesus enough? She says, is it enough? And basically, I basically said to her, yes, but it took me into the scriptures and say, okay, God, this is now not just anybody. This is my mother. And there are always these scriptures that gave me some pause about whether or not this was actually true or not. And I went and studied those scriptures and came back to her and feel tremendous confidence that Jesus is in fact enough.
Well, again, if we can, for just a minute, let's mention those at least briefly. Mark chapter 10, of course, you have the so-called rich young ruler comes to Jesus and says, Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And, of course, Jesus says, well, why do you call me good? And then takes him through the commandments and those kinds of things. And then, of course, he says, one thing you lack, go sell everything you have, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, then come and follow me. And it may be the only time when an individual seeking salvation from Jesus actually went away sad. I mean, others accepted him, or else they had already rejected him before they got here. But certainly the sad experience was certainly a pause for you to say, well, is there something else I need to do or something else my mother needs to do in order to be saved? How did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I think people reading the Bible plainly, which we certainly teach people, it would seem to conclude that Jesus was saying, not only do you need to keep all of the commandments perfectly, but you need to step it up a notch and sell everything you have and give it to the poor and follow me. Because the question that he's answering is, what must I do to inherit eternal life?
Right.
And it seems like Jesus was, just saying straight up, man, you don't just need to keep the law, you need to keep, and I think, okay, I need to deal with this, because sometimes you feel like the teachings of Jesus might somehow contradict in some ways the teachings of Paul and Peter and all. So I just said, I'm going to take an honest look at it while my mom still has some breath in her body and check it out. And what I determined is that, in fact, there was no contradiction. I really believe when you look at the teaching of Jesus in the Gospel of John over and over again, he talks about belief and faith. So Jesus he's not contradicting himself. I think he was trying to get the guy to admit that he couldn't keep the law. And once he admitted that, and he would come back to, and you called me good, good. And the reason you called me good is because only God is good. So you're admitting I'm God. And therefore, he would have taken him to John 3:16, but the guy walked away, never fully admitting that he couldn't do it on his own.
Yeah, John 3:16. Of course, another passage would be Romans 10. Again, I was in a particular event where people were asking questions, and one of those, I was getting all sorts of different kinds of questions. One of those is, what is the gospel? I said, well, let me give the quick answer here, Romans 10, 9, and 10. Believe in your heart and profess with your mouth and all those kinds of things. But nevertheless, that's another element that we need to talk about as well. But let me give, as we're coming to a break here, a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today, because you have broken this down. Not only is Jesus enough, but then we're going to look at life in between. What happens if I die without Christ? That's pretty sobering, so I'll warn everybody that's where we're going on that. Then what happens if I die with Christ? So without Christ and with Christ. Then we're going to look at not only life in between, but then life forever. What happens if I don't know Christ when he returns? What happens if I do know Christ when he returns? And then just all sorts of great question and answer sections in the book on dealing with those very important issues, and, all sorts of things. Will rewards be given out? Will there be pets in heaven? Will we keep our memories? What about guardian angels? All sorts of questions. We'll do our best to try to cover some of those today. And about 200 pages in this book published by Thomas Nelson. As I've said before, you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have a link to Randy Frazee, again, pastor at Westside Family Church. You might remember that he has in the past been the pastor at Oak Hills Church. And I might just mention this time next week we have Max Lucado in studio, so we'll be talking about that as well. But we're going to come back and continue our conversation about this new book, What Happens After You Die, a biblical guide to paradise, hell, and life after death. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Bible gives us a story of the world told through God's perspective.
That is why the Christian worldview provides the best explanation of the world. It answers questions like, why am I here? And what is my purpose in life? Greg Koukl provides a big-picture introduction to the story of the Bible in his new book, The Story of Reality, How the World Began, How it Ends, and Everything Important that Happens in Between. He was on my radio program recently to talk about how this book can answer questions Christians and non-Christians have. Christians need this book to put the puzzle together. Dump a puzzle at your feet and you will see what the Christian puzzle looks like for many believers. It's a pile of pieces that they've never tried to put together. To make matters worse, some of the pieces come from other worldviews and don't even fit the puzzle. This book puts the puzzle together. Non-Christians need this book because it tells the true story of history in a way that makes sense. Greg Koukl anticipates questions and skepticism they may have about the story and answers those questions with his extensive apologetic background. He reminds them that this isn't a religious fairy tale. It's a true story of the way things are. The narrative backbone of the story includes 5 parts: God, man, Jesus, cross, and resurrection. The Bible takes you through a theological tour of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. Christians will be able to fill in the pieces of the puzzle. Non-Christians will be able to see the big picture and understand why it is important for them to make a decision about the truthfulness of the gospel. The Story of Reality would be a great sermon series or Bible study for Sunday school classes or small groups, and it is a book to hand to someone who does not understand the gospel and may even think that it is irrelevant. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Randy Frazee of Westside Family Church. And the book is entitled What Happens After You Die. It's published by Thomas Nelson, a biblical guide to paradise, hell, and life after death. So let's get into this whole section, life in between. What happens if I die without Christ? Randy, we're going to get into some tough things almost immediately. And again, for people that maybe are tuning into this program for the first time, I want you to know that we don't spend our time every day talking about some of these difficult topics. But after all, Jesus spent more time talking about hell than he did about heaven. So churches that can never talk about what happens to people who die without Christ really are not teaching the whole gospel. Don't you agree?
I do agree. I mean, in fact, I'm teaching this series here at Westside Family Church right now, and the people are coming out of the woodworks thanking me that, that they haven't heard this topic taught in a long time. And as you said, it's really laying in the scriptures, and I don't think you really get the gospel. You really certainly don't get grace unless you know what God is saving you from, right? And so there's a lot to be talked about here. It's not popular today, but I'm finding people are very, very interested in hearing the whole truth, because Jesus said when you hear the whole truth, that truth will set you free. And for somebody listening, it could be the most positive thing they've ever heard, because it's the truth.
And a part of it has to do with the different words that were used for what today we call hell. You got Sheol, you got Hades, you've got hell, the outer darkness. Can you sort some of that through for us for just a few minutes?
Yeah, I think, Kerby, one of the big discoveries for me, and I understood this from my training in seminary and all, but it just didn't matter to me as much when I was younger, but just recognizing this big concept that when a person dies, whether they know Christ or not, they go into a place I call in between. And by that, I'm not referring to purgatory or limbo. I'm talking about a second step or a second stage, and there's one more left that takes us into life forever. And so the language of the person who dies, who never received the grace that was offered through Jesus Christ, they ignored it or rejected it. What I believe the Bible teaches is that their body goes into the grave or is cremated or whatever. That body that they inherited from Adam that is perishable dies, and their spirit goes into a place. The Old Testament refers to it like in the underworld, as a place called Sheol in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, Hades in the New Testament. And this is like almost, if you had to put it in contemporary terms, it's almost like a holding place, waiting for final judgment. I used the analogy this Sunday that it's like sitting on death row, waiting for the final judgment yet to be had. The Bible does teach a lot about hell. Probably the parable of Jesus in Luke 16 gives us some of the greatest insight to this temporary place. This is not the final place for people once Christ returns, but this is the place that is in between. And so there's a lot of discussion about what this place actually is like, but one of the things we know for sure, it is a holding place for those waiting for their final judgment and is away from the presence of God. Encourage the listeners to read Luke 16.
Right. And that's what I would say is that some people might say, well, where do you get that? Well, Luke 16 tells the story of the rich man and Lazarus, or the rich man and the beggar. Yeah. And it shows that instantaneously they are finding themselves either in Abraham's side or in Hades. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of, if you will, the in-between place. And those of us that teach at seminary, we call this eschatology, not eschatology like in terms of prophecy, but eschatology in terms of personal eschatology. So that's one chapter. But then people say, okay, what about what happens if I die with Christ? I think you still have in Luke 16 the same answer, but then after the resurrection, you have a different answer. So explain that if you might.
You know, Kerby, this was the biggest discovery for me, and I just keep really working this through to make sure that everyone understands this very clear distinction. You know, that even when a person has received Christ in this life, when they die, they go to be with the Lord now that Christ has been crucified. But it is not the final place. Actually, I think you know this, Kerby. The Old Testament doesn't speak very much at all about the afterlife.
Right.
And the New Testament, when it's speaking about the afterlife, it really doesn't have that many passages of Scripture that deal with what happens to us as believers after we die. Most of it has to do at the return of Christ and the resurrection, right? So the idea of I think most people's theology about the afterlife, particularly for Christians, comes from sort of a welter of folk belief that comes from country music and jokes about St. Peter standing at the pearly gates and movies like It's a Wonderful Life. The idea that there's streets of gold and pearly gates, that's not at this moment in time. What I understand the Scriptures to be saying, and it'd be interesting, Kerby, to get your point of view, on what happened. Is Abraham's bosom different, than being in the presence of God now that the blood of Christ has been shed and applied? I kind of take the point of view that Abraham's bosom or paradise was a place apart from the presence of God for Old Testament believers who believed in God, but the blood of Christ had not been applied to them, and that at the crucifixion of Christ, that they have been ushered into the presence of God. And I really believe that heaven, meaning that God's abode is in the heavens up above, not on earth, is really more about being with a person than really much of a description of a place or much about what we do after we die. I don't think we really know much other than we are in the presence of God, and that should be enough for us as we await our final destination in the eternal kingdom.
And again, a lot of this is what you call life in between, or what we sometimes in theology call the intermediate state. But again, we've got all sorts of misconceptions. People on clouds, playing harps, and yet really what is described in the book of Revelation in particular is what eventually is our place in the new heavens and the new earth. And so when people sometimes ask, well, will I know people in heaven? Well, yes, you will. Will I have animals? Well, there's animals described in the new heavens and the new earth. And so once you start understanding that, and of course we've had people like Randy Alcorn on this program talking about his very thick book on heaven, you begin to understand that there are so many misconceptions that as soon as you really clear out those misconceptions and go back and look at the scriptures, you, for the first time, really see what is happening and what actually is a biblical view. But unfortunately, we've so accepted the traditions of men, we haven't studied the Word of God.
Yeah, there's a theologian by the name of Roger Olson. He's down at Baylor, and he wrote a book called Mosaic of Christian Belief, and he really lays it to pastors and teachers that we've got to teach more directly about this topic because our people are really confused and mixed up, and we're allowing culture around us to really dictate one of the most important topics that provides people hope and security for the future. And here I was, a pastor of a large church, and really was confused and underwhelmed with my view of the afterlife, how much more so the people who are desperately wanting to grab hold of truth and hope that is found in the scriptures, and we're not being clear about this. I think it's – matter of fact, I talked to Randy. He did a little forward to my book. We're very good friends. And I said, man, I've stopped calling the ultimate destination for believers heaven because I can't get through to people that – because they think of heaven as being up in the clouds, but your final destination is down on the earth.
Right.
So I refer to heaven as the intermediate state, this life in between after you die. But ultimately, your destination is on the new earth in the new Jerusalem. This is where you receive the room prepared for you in John 14. And I think if believers understood that, one, they would have a much more tangible idea that your spirit is not roaming around in the earth's atmosphere, which should scare most of us, to be honest with you, trying to earn wings and being in a church service 24/7. But the idea that God's going to restore what was lost in Genesis 1 and 2, a beautiful garden in the city of the New Jerusalem, a tangible work to be done. This is a mental model that we have. Remove all the junk, and you've got me there. And I think when John saw the vision in Revelation, talking about this life forever, he ends with the final prayer, "Come, Lord Jesus." I would love for people, this is the hope I have for this book, is that people would get a clear glimpse of what the Scripture does teach about this, and we would have more people praying, as I have begun praying, boy, Lord, I'd really love for you to come now that I see what you've actually got in store for me.
Well said. Again, we've looked at life in between. It has a whole series of questions like things like, is there such things as ghosts, or can we earn our wings and all that? But when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about our future destiny and destination, and that is life forever. What happens if I don't know Christ when he returns? What happens if I do know Christ when he returns? Makes all the difference in the world. All part of this book, What Happens After You Die? Randy Frazee with us. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after these important messages. Stay tuned.
Imagine you work where you know people do not share your faith, and they certainly don't agree with a Christian view of life and culture. You are surrounded by hostility every single day. How important would it be to have solid information to back you up? Jim in South Carolina listens to Point of View in the afternoons. He writes, I teach in a public secular university and enjoy actually being a voice for the biblical Christian worldview in a liberal setting. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for being bold and proclaiming truth. And Jim finishes, I pray for you daily. Jim works in hostile territory, and he prays for Point of View because Point of View is a source of truth. Please help us continue being here for Jim and everyone else. We need you to visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151 and join the Truth Team. Enable us to be here each day by giving each month. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this. are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Maybe you've always had a question about the afterlife, about heaven, hell, about paradise, what that might mean. And, of course, we will certainly entertain all sorts of questions that you might have. So if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some of your calls and some of your questions in just a minute. But let's, if we can, Randy, recognize again that you've been looking up until now in the sections of your book dealing with life in between, what sometimes we call in theology the intermediate state. But you were pointing to, and even mentioning, of course, Randy Alcorn in his book Heaven, those passages that we sometimes seem to ignore about a new heaven and a new earth. And so that gets into your section called Life Forever. And first of all, let's look again at the difficult chapter. What happens if I don't know Christ when he returns? Christ is going to return in the future. What happens to those individuals who have never placed their faith in Jesus Christ?
Great question. Again, a very hard question to address.
Yes.
The Bible is very explicit, and therefore we must teach it because this is truth. And I, like you, Kerby, embrace the Word of God. A lot of the language comes out of Revelation, which we know is interesting prophetic language, where John's trying to describe things that he is seeing that are so much more advanced, and he tries to find language for it, But at the end of the day, I really believe that these events are going to take place in the spirit by which they were offered. And so a person who in life on this earth decides to reject or ignore the offer of Christ, when they die, their body goes into the ground, their spirit goes into a holding place called hell or Sheol or Hades. And then when Christ returns, which begins to unfold in the book of Revelation, particularly chapter 19, when he's returning on a white horse, it ignites a series of events where God is going to, through Christ, now take out the arch enemies of Satan and demons and the beast and the false prophet and all of those things that have created all kinds of havoc for us. But then following that, there is a judgment called the Great White Throne Judgment, where those people that are in Hades in a holding place, I call it death row, are simply awaiting for this final sentencing where they stand before Judge Jesus now. And there are going to be two books, the Bible says in the book of Revelation, two books that are open. The first set containing all of the activities, all the things that they had done on this earth. And the other is called the Book of Life, which contains the names of those people who have received the grace of Christ through faith in this life and life now. And because their names are not written in the book or was blotted out, according to your point of view, that means all they have in standing before Jesus are their works, which are not going to be graded on a curve like your high school teacher, but rather just evidence, as my son, the lawyer, says, beyond a shadow of a doubt, not just a reasonable doubt, will convict every single person that a loving, just God must now execute the final punishment, which is to be thrown into the lake of fire, not to be confused with hell, in my estimation, or Hades, which was the temporary place, but a place Jesus called Gehenna. He gave it a name because he created it, I think, for the purpose not of human beings, but rather ultimately to be the destination of Satans and demons and hell. And even the holding tank Hades is thrown into this place, but ultimately because the people on life now rejected the vision of God to be in the future kingdom on earth, in the new garden that's being restored. God honors their choice and throws them into the lake of fire, a lake of burning sulfur, which I think it seems to me to be a literal place. And then there are two views of what happens to them, and I think you know this, Kerby. One is the view of eternal punishment and the view of eternal punishing. Does the person whose body and soul is thrown into the lake of fire, does it experience ongoing punishing, or is it eternal punishment, meaning annihilation or cessation of life, not only of the body and the soul? And there are two different views on that. Bottom line is you want to avoid this at all costs by receiving Jesus Christ as your Savior and having your name written in the book of life and never having to find out.
And again, given the fact that we live in this world where there is so much biblical illiteracy, or even if people know the Bible, but they've never been in a church where the pastor's ever preached on, say, Revelation 19, and there's a little bit in Revelation 20, they're going, what? I've never heard any of that before. Let me encourage you to grab a Bible, and you don't even have to have a Bible. If you have a computer nearby, you can find it on your computer very easily. Most of us have Bibles on our phone. Look up Revelation 19 and 20 and see if that's exactly not what Randy has been sharing. But I want to get to the other one and also leave some time for questions. By the way, if you have some questions, 1-800-351-1212. The other chapter is what happens if I do know Christ when he returns. And the believer does not stand before the great white throne, does not go through that kind of punishment. But there is this idea of the bema seat or the judgment seat of Christ, and some people get all confused about that. So can you help us out with that particular part?
Yeah, the Bible clearly, and for me, Kerby, my journey of this go-around really came out of, I just want to know the truth. And I believe in the authority of Scriptures. And the Bible, people are messed up with the idea, but in fact, there is a judgment for believers, as you refer to as the bema seat. And it actually says it. So we have to sort of, align our lives to the teaching of Scripture. I understand it to be a teaching, a judgment of believers, not to determine one's salvation, but rather it's a reward system based upon the content of our work. The words that we have spoken and the motivations of our heart are all going to be revealed on that day, and rewards are given out. I believe the rewards are given out. Some would say just to lay back at the feet of Jesus again in heaven. Again, I don't use the word heaven to refer to the final destination, but there's going to be life on earth, and that life on earth, much like our life now, or even the life envisioned with Abraham, Adam, naming the animals and tending to the garden and all those things, there's going to be work and things to do to manage the kingdom and the earth of God. And I think that this reward system might have something to do with the place that we have on the new kingdom.
Very good. We had a couple of people want to ask some questions. One that couldn't stay with us, but let me raise that question that she had, and that is, okay, we talk about this idea of an intermediate state, and so there go to be in Abraham's bosom in the Old Testament, and that's described by Jesus. But what does Jesus say to the thief on the cross? Today you'll be with me in what? Paradise. So how do we understand this idea of paradise that Jesus talks about in terms of what you call the intermediate, I guess I should say call the intermediate state, or what you call life in between? Can you explain that?
Absolutely. Again, when we deal with subjects like this that don't have an enormous amounts of Scripture for us to interpret and verify, we have to sort of, develop some, of our points of view. I look through the Scriptures and I see that the word paradise is interchangeable with Abraham's bosom. And it would be my point of view that Jesus doesn't arise from the dead and go back to the Father until Sunday does he rise from the dead, and doesn't actually ascend back to the Father for some time after that. So when he says to the thief who just had made a confession of Christ, today you'll be with me in paradise, some take the point of view, and I'm one of them, that Jesus is going into Hades, which has two chambers to it based on Luke 16. One chamber is Abraham's bosom, also referred to as paradise. There's a chasm, and then the other chamber is simply referred to as Hades, where the rich man was at, and all those who rejected Christ, God up to that point. It's my belief that the blood sacrifices of the animals, Hebrews 10:4 tells us, wasn't actually sufficient to make good payment, and therefore kept them from the presence of God. Why God was quarantined, if you will, in the Holy of Holies, because the animal sacrifices weren't sufficient. And therefore, after the blood of Christ has been shed, I believe it was applied to them, and Jesus is coming in to that chamber called Abraham's bosom or paradise with the thief on the cross, and he's saying to them, let's get out of here. And I think at that point they were ushered into the very presence of God, because the blood of Christ is actually sufficient to make payment for our sins.
And that kind of fits in with one of the creeds, which we can get into in just a little bit. Let me just mention before we come to a break here that the book is put together not only by looking at these sections on life in between and life forever, but at the very end you have a series of discussion questions for small groups. And then you have a section of all the key Bible verses. So if a listener, especially if I'm thinking about a small group leader, a pastor, maybe a Sunday school leader, wanted to maybe teach this, you've really put together everything necessary to teach it, as you are teaching right now at Westside Family Church. So let me come back and get into a couple more issues and take about some of the questions that you might have. If you have some questions, Randy Frazee will be with us just a little bit longer. What happens after you die? And we'll see if we can drop in one or two questions before the hour is up. But if you just joined us, talking about his new book, What Happens After You Die, it is published by Thomas Nelson. Look for it in your local bookstore. And we have information about it on our website, pointofview.net. Stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Liberty Christian Center in Watertown, New York, asked for permission to use the Watertown High School cafeteria for its religious services. As their application stated, the worship services to be conducted in the public school cafeteria would include activities of music, religious instruction, and Christian testimony. But the local school board denied the application, stating that since New York law did not specifically authorize religious organizations to utilize public school buildings, the application had to be denied. The court reviewed previous uses of the public school cafeteria. It found that among other uses, the school had been used to host a local talent night, which featured religious music, religious instruction, and even Christian testimony. Since both the worship service and the local talent show shared a religious purpose and context, it was unlawful for the school to permit the talent show but deny the use of the facility for a worship service. Some decry the use of a public school by a religious organization as a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. That is simply not true. The First Amendment demands that the school board be neutral toward religion. Letting a secular organization use school property but denying a religious organization the same use is not neutrality, it's hostility. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Randy Frazee with us today as we talk about his book, What Happens After You Die. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to Wyoming first. Noreen, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi. I watched on TBN, Trinity Broadcasting Network, a couple years ago, and it was a show about people that had died and came back to life. And there was this one guy whose mother always prayed for him to be saved. And he died. He wasn't saved. And he was God took him up to heaven, but before he reached heaven, the devil was there in the dark, and he said, "You belong here." And God took him up, and he saw words. God said stuff like, I am, and whatever he said, but he saved the guy. And then he saw Jesus, and Jesus was like the door, and he stepped aside, and he could see into heaven, green grass and everything. And then he said, "You can come or you could go back." And he saw a vision of his mother, and he decided to go back because he didn't want his mother to think that he went to hell.
Okay, so, again, we've got a lot of these out-of-body experiences, these near-death encounters, and whole books have been written about this, Randy. It seems to me that we need to come back to, Hebrews says, it's appointed man to die, and then after that comes the judgment. So these people maybe are closer to death than you and I maybe have been, but they're still near-death encounters. So I'd be careful about assuming that the experiences they've had necessarily validate or invalidate the Bible, because they're, back to the point you're making, they're part of that intermediate state. They may have been losing consciousness. Their heart might have stopped. They might have been resuscitated. But I'd be careful trying to go too far with some of those stories, wouldn't you?
Yeah, exactly right. I tell you, near-death experience books are just, flying off the shelf. And one of my good friends, John Burke, has written one that has just done extremely well. And they're very, very, I think people just desperately want more tangible evidence from people. I remember in Luke 16, the rich man said, "Hey, tell Abraham to go and, send Lazarus back to tell my brothers." And remember, Jesus said in the parable, if they don't believe Moses and the prophets, they're not going to believe someone coming back from the dead. And I always thought, well, actually, I would. I would believe someone who had actually died and come back from the dead. So I think people are desperate for more tangible truth. And I've always been taught, Kerby, never to deny a person's experience, never to really begin arguing at the point of what is subjective. And also that if it points people to God, and draws them closer to him, that, be thankful for that. In my search for my book, it was really more, I really don't really get too much into experiences as much as I'm just trying to anchor myself in the sort of the truth of God's word. And I studied the whole near-death experience in the scriptures, and this is what I found. I found, Paul is ushered up into the third heaven, he says. It's not from a near-death experience, but it's a vision he received. And I found it interesting that Paul said, "Hey, I saw a lot of things in this vision, but I wasn't permitted to tell you what I saw." And I thought that was kind of interesting, because a lot of people are coming back from these near-death experiences, and they're telling you in great detail what they saw, and Paul wasn't allowed. The other one I saw, which I think is kind of helpful, but it wasn't a near-death experience, is when Stephen is being stoned. He saw heaven open up and Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father. And I really believe that was a genuine encounter. Stephen hadn't died yet. He's about ready to, but he has this sort of spiritual encounter with Jesus, which I think could be very well a very similar concept in Psalm 23, where he says, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." That for believers who have placed their faith in Christ, at some point, God, or as it says in Luke 16, the angels came and carried him to Abraham's bosom. I do believe there's spiritual forces for good that are at work. But I tell you, the one that I lean the most on is a guy that died, not just a near-death experience, but really died, and was in the grave for 3 days and rose again from the dead. That's the death experience that comes back to life, that really gives me the most confidence moving forward.
That's what I oftentimes say. I'm not going to trust in a resuscitation after 3 minutes. How about trusting instead in a resurrection after 3 days? So good arguments.
Yeah.
Let's, if we can, go to North Carolina, WLGP, Virginia. I'd love to hear your testimony and question.
Hi, Kerby. First, I'd like to say I really appreciate and enjoy your program and all that you do. I have lost both my parents, a brother and a sister, but nothing comes close to when I buried my child. My son was 47, a godly man, a wonderful husband, son, brother, father, just a really wonderful human being, and he got brain cancer. And we watched him for 4 years deteriorate and finally passed away. And I know where he is, and that gives me comfort. Even though I can't hold him, I can't touch him, I can't say I love you, I can't interact with him ever again in the flesh. But I read Luke 16, and my question is, the rich man knew what he left behind. Does my son know what he left behind? Lazarus didn't. They don't tell you anything about what Lazarus, how he was interacting in Luke 16.
You know, there's a question that people ask all the time, and that is, would our loved ones watch over us? You always hear that phrase. There is a place in the book of Revelation where they do know what's happening on earth, but I don't know that, if you will, people that are in this intermediate state or in that place that you refer to as kind of the life in between, where they're like watching TV sets, but they do sort of know a little bit because in the book of Revelation, they seem to know something about what has happened on earth, don't they?
You know, that's first of all, you know, my heart, bleeds for this caller. I've lost my parents. I buried my brother's son at 37 last year, and the pain for those of us that are left behind, even though if they're believers, we know they're in a great place, we still find ourselves just sort of aching for their community and their love, and that's the beauty of the story of what's promised in Jesus, for sure. The idea, the caller is right on track. It doesn't say anything about Lazarus or the beggar in this parable. It's as though they are sort of being protected. It says that the rich man can see into Abraham's bosom, but it never says that the beggar can see back into Hades. And I think there's some level of comfort that our loved ones who have gone to be with Jesus are not having to sort of interface and interact. And we need to be grateful for that. They're in the presence of Jesus, and it wouldn't be much like heaven if they had to be in that place with Jesus and not be able to do anything about what they see happening on this earth. And so I do want to offer up, though, that there is a day that not only will you be able to be with your son, but on the new kingdom, you will be able to touch him, and you will be able to, in the flesh, be able to embrace him. As a matter of fact, I was going to take my mom on this trip to Niagara Falls, and she died 3 days before we were to go. And when I read Revelation chapter 22 and the description of the new garden, it rivals the Niagara Falls. And I believe at the end of the day, the trip wasn't canceled. It was just postponed.
Yeah. A new heaven, a new earth, a new body, all of that, you know, and Virginia's son's body will be healed. And that is certainly great news as well. Randy, it's just always great to have you on the program, and wish you and your wife and everyone well at Westside Family Church. And again, thank you for joining us today. The book, one more time, What Happens After You Die, A Biblical Guide to Paradise, Hell, and Life After Death. And always great to have you in the program. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation about some of the issues in the news, all that coming up right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Randy Frazee was with us the last hour as we talked about his book, What Happens After You Die. And we had a question about afterlife experiences, some of these near-death encounters, and that is a topic that I've written about before. And I thought for just a minute I might, before we get into some of the issues in the news, and we've posted quite a number of articles today on all sorts of different issues, I thought I might just give a little bit more of an answer. And the first is to recognize that for many years, there have been these best-selling books on the subject of near-death encounters. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, for example, and Raymond Moody have written those different books. As a matter of fact, Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, sold about 13 million copies. And many of these have this idea of there being an out-of-body experience, maybe traveling down a long, dark tunnel, maybe sometimes seeing a review of their life pass before them, meeting maybe other people that have died. Sometimes they say they communicate with a being of light. And so, again, how do you explain some of those? And first of all, I would say that some of those have just reasonable physiological explanations. Medical studies over the years have found that anywhere from 10 to 30% of all people that survive a cardiac arrest have some kind of near-death experience. Now, that could be something very significant, or it could be something where they come back and say, well, I felt like I was floating over my body for a minute, but that was it. And interestingly enough, surveys that have been done by George Gallup estimate maybe about 5% of the general population have had those kinds of feelings. And so some of those could be, you know, if it would be physiological. Some of those could be pharmacological, because after all, sometimes they're on certain kinds of drugs and those kinds of things. The physiological phenomenon of traveling down a long, dark tunnel, when you have what's called cerebral anoxia, lack of oxygen in the brain, you can have that feeling sometimes of traveling down that. This idea of review of your life passing before you, well, that's when in a stress situation, sometimes certain memories pass before you in your brain. People that have never been pronounced dead, maybe just were in a car accident or had a strike of something that was causing them some kind of stress, sometimes say that is the case. So in some respects, those could be simply explained physiologically or psychologically or pharmacologically. But then we do have a few that seem to be more paranormal. And that's where, for example, people see a being of light. And so, again, that is a question that we might want to ask. But again, back to the point I made just a minute ago, in the book of Hebrews 9:27, it says it is appointed for us to die once, and after that comes the judgment. And so, again, some people have had some of these after-death experiences. The classic illustration, of course, would be Lazarus in the book of John 11. But you have the widow's son in Luke 7. Even in the Old Testament, you have, in 1 Kings, the widow of Zarephath, and some others. So you do have a few of those. But again, the fact is that many times these people come back and they have, pretty much pleasant experiences. And so does that fit with this idea that they should, in some cases, especially if they've never accepted Jesus Christ, should be like that rich man that is described in Luke 19? And so there are some books that have come out over the years, one in particular called Beyond Death's Door, Maurice Rollins, that as an individual who oftentimes resuscitates individuals, points out that some of these have terribly unpleasant experiences, but then later when he went back to talk to them, they had forgotten them. Either they were repressed or they were forgotten. And so it seems to me that that is certainly a possibility, that sometimes maybe somebody did have something that was unpleasant, but they didn't come back and report it. But what about this idea of running into a being of light? Because almost every time they see a being of light, they say, well, that's got to be God, or that was Jesus. Not necessarily. I would encourage you to look up in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 14. Paul refers to what? Satan as an angel of light, and even talks about those who are his emissaries, which would be his demons, disguise themselves as messengers of righteousness. So sometimes when these people say they've had these out-of-body experiences that prove that there is mandatory heaven for everyone, you got to be a little more skeptical about that as well. And so let me recommend, some books that I think are much better to read. One, of course, we've referred to Randy Alcorn's book, Heaven. This particular book by Randy Frazee, What Happens After You Die. Another book that I might recommend, Erwin Lutzer, 1 Minute After You Die, are all just attempts to really kind of address that issue. And really, if you want to understand what true heaven is like, you could do a word study. And Randy Alcorn, in his book, Heaven, says the word heaven occurs 559 times in the Bible. So this year, if you wanted to do kind of a word study, it will take you a while to actually go through and study all of the various places in which heaven is described. And our present heaven, which we see in Revelation 6, referred to by Jesus as paradise, is certainly one of those issues. But we don't oftentimes spend as much time looking at the new heavens and the new earth. And that's where I think the book by Randy Alcorn is such a good book, because it then helps us understand what our future destiny is like. And that is going to be very different than this intermediate state or this present heaven that we have right now. It is described in Revelation 21 as a place of beauty. It tries to describe this in human terms of what it's like. And so it talks about streets of gold. You always heard about streets paved with gold. I don't know if it's really gold or it looked like that to John, but that's how he tries to describe it, using the best imagery he has, buildings of pearl. That's where you get the idea of the pearly gates, precious stones. It certainly is a beautiful place. It does have gates. It talks about in Revelation 21 where we can travel in and out. It's a city that's a capital. It's a place where we also will see the face of Jesus. We see that in Revelation 22. And so in some respects, it just gives us an understanding that indeed in heaven that we will worship God, we'll rest from our labors. We see that in Revelation 14. We'll eat, we'll drink, we'll celebrate that. We see that in Revelation 19. It's a place where we will serve God. We see that in Revelation 22. And some people have even thought it might be a place where we explore the universe, because in Ephesians it talks about God is seated in the heavenly places. So indeed, that may be something we would go through as well. So I thought I'd just mention that, again, we have to be real careful when we have these out-of-body experiences. Some of those may even be valid ones. We certainly see that with Paul being caught up in the third heaven. Of course, John was told to record what he actually saw in this vision. And, of course, we have some other examples that are, of course, in Luke 19. But most importantly, I think it's incumbent upon all of us that maybe we need to get back into God's Word. Many times we've accepted the traditions of men instead of the Word of God. And so I think this new book, What Happens After You Die, is just one more book I would recommend to help you think clearly about your eternal destiny. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover in the news. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the Bible gives us a story of the world told through God's perspective. That is why the Christian worldview provides the best explanation of the world. It answers questions like, why am I here? And what is my purpose in life? Greg Koukl provides a big-picture introduction to the story of the Bible in his new book, The Story of Reality, How the World Began, How It Ends, and Everything Important That Happens in Between. He was on my radio program recently to talk about how this book can answer questions Christians and non-Christians have. Christians need this book to put the puzzle together. Dump a puzzle at your feet and you will see what the Christian puzzle looks like for many believers. It's a pile of pieces that they've never tried to put together. To make matters worse, some of the pieces come from other worldviews and don't even fit the puzzle. This book puts the puzzle together. Non-Christians need this book because it tells the true story of history in a way that makes sense. Greg Koukl anticipates questions and skepticism they may have about the story and answers those questions with his extensive apologetic background. He reminds them that this isn't a religious fairy tale. It's a true story of the way things are. The narrative backbone of the story includes 5 parts: God, man, Jesus, cross, and resurrection. The Bible takes you through a theological tour of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. Christians will be able to fill in the pieces of the puzzle. Non-Christians will be able to see the big picture and understand why it is important for them to make a decision about the truthfulness of the gospel. The Story of Reality would be a great sermon series or Bible study for Sunday school classes or small groups, and it is a book to hand to someone who does not understand the gospel and may even think that it is irrelevant. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. It's just been announced that President Trump has decided to exit the Iran nuclear agreement, and we'll get more into that in the future as we know more. And, of course, get some experts to speak to that issue. But I thought for just a few minutes I would talk about the subject of sex education. You might say, why is that? Well, one of the things I like to, from every once in a while, try to do here is help you to develop some discernment. And if you listen to this program, you know that lots of times we encourage you to reevaluate what you read, see, and hear. What you hear on radio, including even the things that I talk about. Check it out. That's why we put various articles. As a matter of fact, we're going to put some of those up there in just a minute. Also, whether you go to a website and read something there, hear something, watch something on the news, these are all important to evaluate and to have some discernment. One aspect of discernment, though, is to recognize when sometimes there's a campaign, and there is very obviously a campaign taking place. Turns out that on Saturday, the New York Times wrote an op-ed piece really attacking the Trump administration on the issue of sex education. And so I thought about maybe later in the week talking about this because our friends at the Family Research Council, Tony Perkins and others, have written about this called New York Times Bites Off More Than It Can Skew, which is kind of a turn of phrases. And so I thought I'd cover that until I open up this morning's USA Today. And those of you watching online can see that it says Sex Ed, an age-old struggle of morality versus reality enters a new era. Politics, pop culture, even the Me Too shift the battleground again. And so I'm starting to recognize a campaign.
to actually criticize the Trump administration, in particular the Department of Health and Human Services, and there has been just a lot of misinformation. So for just a few minutes, I want to take on what is in USA Today, then take on what was in the New York Times, so that you have some discernment about what is going to, I think, be an ongoing battle over this issue of whether we should teach comprehensive sex education in the public schools. By the way, we already are teaching that. Really, the battle is whether or not we should also teach abstinence. Here's some of the facts in USA Today. First of all, 24 states and the District of Columbia require sex education. 37 states require information be provided on the subject of abstinence, and 26 of those states actually require that abstinence be stressed. The big issue has to do with the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program. This was developed back in 2010 through the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare. And so that has been in place for more than 7 years. It is now being replaced, not exclusively, but there has been the attempt to fund other things like abstinence and to begin to cut back on that program because it has been proven to be ineffective. You wouldn't necessarily know that if you read USA Today, or especially if you read the New York Times. So I want to spend a little bit of time helping you understand what the argument is and then give you an answer. And that is, first of all, in USA Today, it says, for more than a century, the nation has been engaged in a war over sex education in the American schools. No doubt there. Battles ignite around questions that seem practical but are decidedly moral. Should teens be given more information about sex or less? Should they be encouraged to wait until marriage? Do young people have a right to understand their sexuality, or do adults have a duty to protect them from it? The reality is some of those questions are a little bit biased, but, we'll let them go. And then it talks about the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program implemented in 2010, which was an initiative under President Obama, actually part of the Affordable Care Act known as Obamacare, and it offers a comprehensive approach to sex education. Then this article says President Trump wants to defund the program, but in the past month, 3 federal judges ruled to block the administration's cuts to grants issued through the initiative. It says advocates of the program say it is a proven track record of success. The teen birth rate declined to historic lows in 2015. Remember that. There's a difference between the teen birth rate and the teen pregnancy rate. That's something to pay attention to, because lots of times they'll say they lower the teen birth rate. Yeah, there were more pregnancies, but those kids that got pregnant, they went to the abortion clinic, so it lowered the teen birth rate. It's not lowering teen pregnancy, so pay attention to whether it says teen birth, teen pregnancy. Very important issue, especially if you're concerned about the issue of abortion. And then it goes on and quotes from a number of groups, and the pro-sex education, comprehensive sex education group gets the most press. Deborah Hauser, for example, of Advocates for Youth, is quoted extensively, as well as the president of SIECUS, which is the Sexual Information and Education Council of the United States, gets some quotes. And then we do, to be fair, let's be fair, Robert Rector actually is quoted. He's with the Heritage Foundation, wrote a 2010 report for Heritage Foundation, gets a little bit of a mention. And so that's kind of what you have today in the front page of USA Today. Okay, that brings us up to the piece I was going to cover later in the week, but since it's starting to become kind of an issue right now, let me, if I can, quote briefly from some of the material from our friends at the Family Research Council, in which they actually said that fake news, they said, is alive and well and thriving on the pages of America's biggest newspapers. No wonder more people are tuning out the media, they say. Don't trust it, and the outlets like the New York Times aren't giving them any reason to try. Our friends at Family Research Council said at some point the Times editorial board must have gotten together and decided to reprint every lie ever told about abstinence education. The result was Saturday's work of fiction, a breathtakingly dishonest 602-word crime scene of journalism that justifies America's growing distrust of the press. A little bit over the top, but nevertheless, the point they were making is that the only thing they felt was accurate was with the fact that it was placed on the opinion page. But nevertheless, he said they go on to say that the editor's agenda was obvious, discrediting the sex education approach that's popular, effective, and grossly underfunded. And then they go through some of the things that are actually said. So here's just a couple of quotes to help you understand what was in the Saturday op-ed, or I guess it was just the Saturday editorial, I should say, in the New York Times. For example, they said that the Department of Health and Human Services is, quote, advancing an anti-science ideological agenda by trying to level the funding field for abstinence, unquote. Then it goes on to say that the department last year prematurely ended grants to some teen pregnancy prevention programs, claiming weak evidence of success. More recently, it set new funding rules that favor an abstinence-only approach, unquote. So again, those are a couple of the quotes that indeed were in the New York Times editorial. Okay, how do we respond? I'll take some of this before the break, and then we'll get into a little bit more afterwards. And again, since we're talking about sex, maybe a parental advisory. I don't know that you have any grade school kids listening right now, or preschool kids, but I might occasionally have to use a word since we're talking about sex education. So there's where we go on that. But first of all, the piece by the Family Research Council says that President Barack Obama's own Department of Health and Human Services admitted outright that this contraception-first strategy was a billion-dollar failure. More than 80% of the students in the program fared either worse or no better than their peers. And so they say that's hardly the stuff of weak evidence, which was one of the quotes in the New York Times. According to the last administration, Obama's approach was a disaster, resulting in more pregnancies, more sexual initiation, and more oral sex. Then they said, not surprisingly, the Trump administration doesn't think programs that encourage pregnancy are the wisest use of federal funds, so it rewrote the rules, shifting a modest amount of money to the strategy that is actually supported in one of the studies by the Centers for Disease Control. But again, when you were to read the New York Times, you would think that it was completely defunding comprehensive sex education. No, liberal sex education still rakes in $980 million, whereas sexual risk avoidance, which would include abstinence, about $100 million. So if you round it up, $1 billion to $100 million, that's a 10-to-1 ratio, where still taxpayer dollars are going much more toward the funding of comprehensive sex education, sort of liberal, explicit sex education, and a smaller percentage to abstinence. But that was enough for the New York Times to actually begin to say that the approach violates and defies common sense and is an attempt to put abstinence on an equal ground, which is hardly the case. When we come back from the break, I want to take a little bit more to get into a couple of the other issues, because, after all, there were some claims made by the New York Times, and a few even in USA Today, that just don't stand up to scrutiny. And we have the studies to demonstrate that. And we'll take a break. And if you'd like to join us, maybe you have some comments, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some more calls right after this.
Rebecca Hagelin has been influencing public policy as an author, columnist, and executive at places like the Heritage Foundation for more than 30 years, and Point of View Radio stoked her fire.
I used to turn it on every day, and when my husband would come home from work, I would say, this is what they said on Point of View today, and this is what they said. I just wanted to be connected into the places where I could make a difference.
Rebecca has made a big difference with her life, and let's just say she's a big fan.
There's no better resource, there's no better truth sayer, there's no better place to go for information for people who are worthy of their money than Point of View.
Point of View makes a difference by inspiring and informing people who make a difference. And you can make a difference today when you invest in the Truth Team. Join us today. Find out how by calling 1-800-347-5151 or visit online, pointofview.net/team, 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking for just a few more minutes about this subject of sex education was something I was going to get to later, but I'm noticing a campaign to begin to go back and refund the teen pregnancy prevention program sort of implemented under Obamacare and to discredit the idea of abstinence education. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's, before I get back to some of the things said by the Family Research Council, go to California and hear from Kevin. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me on the show.
Sure. What would you like to share?
Yeah, I want to talk about New York. That's Donald Trump's territory, if I'm not mistaken. And I want to just say this. This article in the media specifically, the information that comes out is always skewed. It always seems to come from a liberal viewpoint. But the way they present it, it's almost like reverse technology. We need more millennials out there in the battle. Two things. Donald Trump was a light in darkness in New York. Okay, yeah, he had some problems. Who didn't? I don't know any president, including Obama, that didn't have problems. There's a whole bunch of them. There's 43 or 44 or 45 of them. I don't get it. We need to fight battles. Listen, if you're not willing to put your faith on the line and speak out and be controversial about things, if you're ready to settle, you're on the wrong ball team. And I'm looking at four things here. One, the media has been doing this for a long time. They have inserts. Inserts are, people that are there for a specific reason to get a certain agenda done. And you know what, people? We have to stand up and rise up against that kind of stuff. If the president's getting bad PR, and I don't care what president you are, they've all gotten it, it's because somebody somewhere, whether it's in the media or somewhere else, is out there fighting that battle. That's only one arena, people. We have to be able to stand up, and we have to tell the truth, and there's going to be warfare. So that's my contribution to this. I appreciate you guys having me.
Well, appreciate your contribution, and love to have you or anybody else call back if they want to add something to the conversation. And part of it is, if you're going to be in the battle, you need to have some good facts. You need to have your weapons. I don't want it to sound too militaristic, but, one of those facts is the fact that if indeed the people at the New York Times want to say that this approach, and I'm quoting from that, the administration's approach defies all common sense. There is no good evidence that abstinence-only education prevents or delays young people from having sex, leads them to having fewer sexual partners, or reduces rates of teen pregnancy or sexually transmitted infections. Okay, that's their quote, unquote. And I love what our friends at the Family Research Council say. Did the Times fire all of its fact checkers? Because the Centers for Disease Control 2 years ago, just about a year and a half ago, actually, in 2016, actually came up with just the opposite conclusion. Now, either the Center for Disease Control doesn't know what it's doing. That's a theoretical possibility, but not likely in a peer-reviewed journal article or two. Or the New York Times doesn't know what they're talking about. I'll let you figure out which one it is. Here's just one of the quotes from here. It talks about the absence message not only affects their sexual health, it affects all sorts of other health. And you don't even have to accept this article because I've posted a commentary. You can go to our Viewpoints commentary, type on the word like virgins or sex education or something like that. You will find the article. It came out just about a week or two ago. But here's a quote from the CDC, okay? Quote, high school students who are virgins rate significant and consistently better in nearly all health-related behaviors and measures than their sexually active peers, unquote. They found that this included everything from, quote, bike helmets to seat belts to substance abuse, diet, doctor's visits, exercise, even tanning bed use, unquote. And so in some respects, I love what our friends at the Family Research Council said. Abstinence education is like one-stop shopping for healthier behavior. And then, of course, the other part of this, which, again, I appreciate our good friends at the Family Research Council, and I've documented this also in my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, in the chapter on sex and sex education, is that you also have what happens when young people do get involved sexually. They found that this also affects things like financial hardship, school failure, and depression. For example, I was just speaking on this recently. Actually, it was in Budapest, Hungary, when I was speaking on the issue of sex and sex education and how the church should address those issues, that sometimes those who are sexually active are 3 times more likely to be depressed than those who are not. And it's broken down by male and female. And then sometimes 2 times more likely to consider suicide than those who do not. So we are talking about some very significant positive behaviors if you actually hear the abstinence message and act on it, and some very significant negative behaviors if you ignore it or pursue this idea of comprehensive sex education. One last point, and that is we have over the years documented through various surveys, and I have that in my book as well, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, surveys that show that young people really want this information. A more recent survey, which I hope to put in maybe a revised version of my book, is a survey that was done by the Barna Group of 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds, and they found that kids wanted to learn how to, quote, understand healthy and unhealthy relationships, 65% said that, avoid sexual assault, 64% said that, how alcohol impairs judgment, 61% agreed with that, and how to say no to sex without losing a relationship, 57% said that. As the Family Research Council summarized it only so well, young people are relationship-driven, not sex-obsessed. And most of them agree that today's curriculum, especially the sex education curriculum, pressures them too much to have sex. As a matter of fact, they also agreed that they thought that lessons on sexual pressuring and pleasuring were not very important compared to the skills to say no, 63%. So, again, you can see that what we are dealing with is something that desperately needs to be addressed. Now, one last comment before we take a break, and that is when you go to some of these presentations by Planned Parenthood, and I've done so, when you read the literature by Planned Parenthood, and I have done so, oftentimes they tend to quote a survey or a study. One that gets quoted most often was one that shows how effective condoms are in actually preventing sexually transmitted diseases. I'll just cite one of those, which was a study done of AIDS-infected individuals who had partners who, because they consistently used condoms, indeed, did not contract HIV. There's at least 2 major problems with that survey and that study. The first is that many of these sexually transmitted diseases can still be transferred even if you do not use a condom. So that's the first issue. And that's no small issue, by the way, because we're talking about viral infections. But the bigger one, I think, applies to anyone out there that is a parent or a grandparent that's had a teenager or has a teenager right now. Because if you go back and look at that particular study that was done of AIDS-infected individuals, in which they found that none of the partners actually got HIV, it turns out that one of the things they said is that this worked because the condoms were used consistently and correctly. Now, let me ask you, if you have a teenager in your house right now, or you've had a teenager in your house, do the words consistently and correctly actually fit teenage behavior? I don't know about you, but I could not get my kids to consistently and correctly brush their teeth. I could not get my teenagers to consistently take their bag lunch out to school every day. I could not ever get them sometimes to consistently and correctly wash off their dishes and put them in the dishwasher. What are my chances of them using one of these devices consistently and correctly in the heat of passion? And I think you have the answer. So yes, these studies sometimes do seem to show that it could be a safer sex. They don't even use the word safe sex anymore. They just use safer sex. But again, think about those words consistently and correctly, and you can see some of the problem that we have here. Well, nevertheless, I wanted to cover that real briefly, if for no other reason than the fact that I get the sense we're going to be in the midst of a campaign to discredit abstinence and to promote comprehensive sex education. We're already spending almost $1 billion on it right now. And I guess for the groups like Planned Parenthood and SeekUs, that's still not enough. And they don't want any money spent at all on telling young people maybe it's wise to wait till marriage to be sexually involved. We'll take a break. Got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Liberty Christian Center in Watertown, New York, asked for permission to use the Watertown High School cafeteria for its religious services. As their application stated, the worship services to be conducted in the public school cafeteria would include activities of music, religious instruction, and Christian testimony. But the local school board denied the application, stating that since New York law did not specifically authorize religious organizations to utilize public school buildings, the application had to be denied. The court reviewed previous uses of the public school cafeteria. It found that among other uses, the school had been used to host a local talent night, which featured religious music, religious instruction, and even Christian testimony. Since both the worship service and the local talent show shared a religious purpose and context, it was unlawful for the school to permit the talent show but deny the use of the facility for a worship service. Some decry the use of a public school by a religious organization as a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. That is simply not true. The First Amendment demands that a school board be neutral toward religion. Letting a secular organization use school property but denying a religious organization the same use is not neutrality, it's hostility. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, let me just wind it down today by talking about a couple of issues in the news that we haven't really covered. One is, you may have noticed that the New York Attorney General, as many people have said, the latest scalp in the hashtag #MeToo reckoning, individual that has been a very liberal, progressive Democrat who was elected to his second term as state attorney general. Now you have 4 women that have finally come forward to say that he has physically assaulted them. You just, again, oftentimes wonder, how does this take place? This one may be a little easier to understand because, if nothing else, he had a lot more power over those individuals and certainly could ruin their lives. But when you think about some of these other individuals, I might just mention that those of you watching online, I'm holding up our latest Outlook magazine. On the cover, of course, it has a picture of Harvey Weinstein, and, of course, he had power over those women, too. He could make or break an actress's career. But our latest issue is Understanding the Me Too Movement and an Over-Sexualized Culture. Very good piece by Penna Dexter on the hashtag Me Too is a mixed bag, and then a piece that I've put together on sexual harassment. looking at this issue of sexual harassment and sexual assault based on some of the interviews we've done with June Hunt, and even a commentary there on sexting as well. But when you look at this, he certainly had power over them, and maybe that is the reason why. Matt Lauer certainly did. Certainly Charlie Rose might have as well, and Harvey Weinstein. But again, it is, I think, a truism that as you look down this list, many of them, first of all, had some level of power, but also, I think, politics. If they take, if you will, the right stands on women's issues, feminism. I mean, this is a man that for a while was a public defender of the hashtag #MeToo movement. And as an individual that has challenged the Trump administration, he checked all the boxes for a lot of the women maybe to give him a pass. But eventually it caught up with him, as it did with Harvey Weinstein. The same people that broke the story about Harvey Weinstein are the ones that broke the story about the Attorney General for the state of New York, Eric Schneiderman. So one of those issues in the news, and again, it relates very much to the May issue of Outlook magazine. My first article that we have posted here for you today is an article by Robert Knight. Robert Knight calls it Giving Trump's Accomplishment Their Due. He said, I was told by one of my favorite millennials that many of her friends have not heard anything at all positive about President Trump. He goes on to say the left, which turned a blind eye to the flagrant immorality of Ted Kennedy and Bill Clinton, is ordering evangelical Christians to abandon Mr. Trump. And as I've said on this program many times before, but I'll say it again, I mean, we can do two things at once. We can say we are appalled by some of the past behavior of Donald Trump. We don't need to turn a blind eye on it any more than liberals did to Ted Kennedy or Bill Clinton. But at the same time, we also don't need to ignore some of the accomplishments. And again, these accomplishments go on for pages about appointments to the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch, as well as 75 other judges. Next week, I have a commentary coming out, which we also talked about a little bit last Friday, of James Ho, who is one of those individuals that was appointed by Donald Trump and has been confirmed in his first opinion out of the box on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, something that I think all of us would appreciate from a constitutional point of view. Goes through all sorts of actions by the president on issues like the Mexico City policy relating to abortion, the issue of immigration and sanctuary cities, the attempt to actually cut back regulations. There was an order to actually kill 2 regulations for every one that was implemented. The ratio ended up being about 16 to 1. Of course, you have the climate agreement that we've withdrawn from. Just a few hours ago, I mentioned we have also apparently now going to withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal. You have some of these environmental rules that have been removed, and we talked about that yesterday with Stephen Moore. Of course, the facilitating of the Keystone XL pipeline, the opening up of areas for oil and gas exploration, the fact the United States might, can you believe this, become an energy-independent country, might even an energy-dominant country. The issue of an order enforcing First Amendment protections for religious liberty, cutting down on sex trafficking, which we talked about with the president of Concerned Women for America, and just the list goes on for pages. And then he does something else, and that is, okay, that's what has been done by Donald Trump, who became president. What would happen if a Hillary Clinton had become president? And that goes on for a couple of pages, and it's just a really good piece. So it's the first article we've posted on our website today, pointofview.net. Second article we've posted is an article by our good friend David French, Civil Liberties Can't Survive Partisan Hatred. I entitled it basically Free Speech and Civil Liberties, but I'm thinking maybe I should just call it Free Speech Equals Hate Speech in the minds of liberals, because they're saying that, for example, here's one of the quotes, free speech is a proxy for the right to say races and sexes are inherently different. Aren't they? Oh, maybe at least the sexes are, but, 100% free speech is about group differences, and so you can see all sorts of comments being made by individuals saying that we cannot have free speech. And then one other piece, I actually posted something I talked about yesterday. It takes about 17 pages to print out, but it's the outrageous redactions of the Russian report. And the redactions are the things that are actually X'd out in these reports from the Justice Department to Congress. And again, the individual that has written this is Andrew McCarthy, used to be a federal prosecutor. And he said, if anything, these redactions tell us that their lack of transparency supposedly is necessary for national security, vital intelligence, and investigative operations. But Andrew McCarthy says what we find out is they were concealing their own questionable judgments, conflicting explanations for their actions, their use of foreign intelligence and criminal investigative authorities to investigate Michael Flynn, Trump's top campaign supporter and a former national security advisor, and their explicitly stated belief that Michael Flynn did not lie to the FBI interview for which special counsel Robert Mueller had been prosecuting him on false statement charges. In other words, these redactions were not there to protect national security or to actually protect a confidential source. They were there to protect people in leadership in the Justice Department who did not want to be exposed. And so we're finding out more and more about that. And again, the Justice Department in the crosshairs today of Congress, Representative Devin Nunes, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, has reached his limit of patience. And he has now said that if indeed he cannot receive the information that he has requested, he is going to hold the Attorney General Jeff Sessions in contempt of Congress. There's only been one Attorney General that's been, in recent times at least, held in contempt of Congress. That's the previous one, Eric Holder. And so we will see whether or not Jeff Sessions will be held in contempt. I doubt he wants to be, and I doubt the problem lies with Jeff Sessions. Maybe it does, but we'll see where that plays itself out. But the Justice Department finds itself in some pretty deep water right now, and we'll see how that plays out. And so a good reason to evaluate and really have some discernment, as we've talked about, some of the news stories that will be coming out in the next couple of days. Well, that's all we have to cover for today. Again, I've posted some of these articles. If you want that information about Trump's accomplishment, some of the redactions to protect the Justice Department, and the issue of free speech and civil liberties, as well as the information from the previous hour on what happens after you die, all available at the website pointofview.net. So again, take the time to go to pointofview.net, click on that button to watch or listen to it again, and you might even click on that button that says Donate Now. We would appreciate your financial support. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.